So Peggy has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from the University of Vermont and a master's degree in wildlife biology from the Louisiana State University. As mentioned before, she is currently the Open Space Resource Management Specialist for the County of Santa Fe. And prior to joining the county, she worked as the non-game avian biologist for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. Peggy is a bird expert and has worked with a variety of bird species in New Mexico, Texas, North Dakota, Washington, Massachusetts, and Louisiana. Peggy has extensive experience in conserving New Mexico's birds and currently serves as Duchat of the New Mexican Avian Conservation Partners. And with all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Peggy Dar. Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen so I can bring up my presentation. Oh, you'll have to go ahead and make sure that's an option for me, Karen. It says that it's disabled screen sharing. Well, Karen's working on that. So my title is pretty long for the Santa Fe County, the Open Space Resource Management Specialist. It's a long-winded way of saying wildlife biologist, and I help the county. The county owns about 6,600 acres of open space property throughout the county. And so what I do is I help to manage those lands for the benefit of wildlife and our other natural resources. So that's what I do for the county in a quick little blurb. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about the Master Naturalist program. It's a really wonderful program for numerous reasons, and we'll get into those reasons. But primarily because not only do you learn a lot about the environment and the wildlife that we live amongst, but you also have a chance to help the environment and help the wildlife species you learn about, and help agencies and organizations that are pretty strapped as far as staff capacity and money to address and fully work on their missions of protecting the environment and wildlife. So it's a great program. Thank you for your interest. And we'll go ahead and start by talking a little bit about the details of the program, requirements, etc. And then we'll move into a sneak peek of what some of the fun things you can learn when you take the class and become a Master Naturalist. So there are many Master Naturalist programs throughout the country, and many have been around for a long time. I'm originally from Vermont, but I did work in Texas for a while before I moved here. And they have a very long-standing Master Naturalist program that's a really wonderful program. This program, however, is pretty new, but the Master Naturalist concept is not new. So that's the main point I want to put across there. So the Northern New Mexico Master Naturalist program was established in 2018. And it's currently hosted by 3 agencies and organizations. So Santa Fe County, obviously, also Audubon Southwest, the staff up at the Randall Davey Audubon Center help with this program, and the Santa Fe Botanical Garden. So those are the 3 sponsoring organizations. And by sponsoring, I mean that we either put money or time or both into this program. And as a result, volunteers work for one of our 3 organizations. So we have a very, in my opinion, a very important mission and a very important vision. So our mission is to foster a diverse community of naturalists equipped to promote awareness, understanding, and stewardship of New Mexico's natural environment, resources, and heritage through education and service with our partner organizations. Again, those are the 3 that I just mentioned. And our vision is to establish a network of involved community members dedicated to addressing the environmental needs of our communities across the northern part of the state. And I will say that this The community that we have here in Santa Fe and northern New Mexico is a wonderful community that is really willing to step up and help with the environmental needs of our community. So it's a wonderful community to work with. So the requirements to become a master naturalist. First, when you decide you want to become a master naturalist, the first thing you're going to have to do, and Peggy Samaha knows this because she has gone through all of this and is one of our wonderful master naturalists helping at the county. So first you have to take the master naturalist class. This is a 13-week course. It generally starts in late summer, August or September, and it goes through the winter for 13 weeks. It amounts to 55 hours of classroom and field instruction. Field instruction, of course, is dependent on COVID. In non-COVID times, we would take field trips. This past year, we had a different format. It was on Zoom, and field trips were, we provided information so that people could go out and do them on their own. So it was a little bit different. It might be that way this coming year as well. But normally we will have numerous field trips where we get out into the field and see beautiful places and learn directly outside. After you complete that course, you then become a master naturalist intern, and you have 1 year after completing the course to volunteer for a minimum of 30 hours with one of those 3 partner sponsoring organizations. And after you've done that, you then become certified. You get a fancy certificate and everything. And to maintain that certification, you then have to complete yearly 25 hours of volunteer work and 5 hours of continuing education work. Now we have a lot of really, when you do your volunteer work, we have a lot of really exciting, important projects that you can work on with all of our sponsoring organizations. You can work helping with habitat restoration. You can help with education and outreach. You can help with some of our research projects that we have going. Or if maybe going outside and hiking a lot isn't something you're interested or able to do, you can help with very important administrative efforts that help keep us all running. So an example, there's so many wonderful projects, but the example I'm going to give here is a project that master naturalists, including the other Peggy, are helping with, is a pinyon seed planting project. This is one of our volunteers out planting pinyon seeds at the Thornton Ranch open space. As we'll talk about later, wildlife species such as the pinyon jay and other wildlife that use our pinyon juniper woodlands, which are these woodlands that are surrounding you in your homes off of Tano Road, they're doing very poorly, very, very poorly, and that's not well known. The pinyon jay is one of the fastest declining bird species in the country, in the world, actually. So, and as we all probably know and have seen and continue to see, that pinyon juniper woodlands, particularly pinyons, are very threatened by climate change as well. So what we're doing with this program is we're trying to increase the climate resilience of our pinyon juniper woodlands on our open spaces. And so we collect pinyon seeds, pinyon nuts, also called pinyon nuts, and we plant them in areas that are probably more climate resilient. So examples would be on the lower half of north and east facing slope, or on the north and east facing sides of a drainage. These are going to be areas that are going to have lower soil temperatures and more moisture. So volunteers, including Peggy, have helped to plant over 1,000 seeds thus far in our first year. So 1,000 trees have been planted at our Thornton Ranch open space, and we will continue to expand upon this effort and plant on additional open spaces. And our partners at Audubon Southwest and also Defenders of Wildlife, the Southwest office, are helping us to expand this program throughout New Mexico and Arizona. So it's a very exciting project. We will also be having master naturalists help us with research aspects of this project, helping us to monitor our planted seeds to determine success, and if we need to change our planting protocols in the future to have optimum success. So that's just one of many very exciting opportunities to get out there and to help wildlife that are declining help mitigate climate change, and so many more things. Now you may, the course, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but there's I'm doing this for a reason. So the course curriculum that you take before you volunteer is also very extensive. These are all the topics we cover. It ranges from talking about geology and soil, which are the basis for everything, to then moving on to talking about specific vertebrates and invertebrates, talking about ecology and land ethics, and even how to communicate science to other people, particularly how to communicate climate change science to people. So it's a very comprehensive course. And after you're done with it, you will then also learn a lot more about your particular area of interest in your project. For example, we have a volunteer from our first class of Master Naturalists that has been doing horned lizard, also known as horny toads, has been surveying for horned lizards and their primary prey, harvester ants, on one of our properties. And she has become an expert. She now knows more about those species than I do, and is a very valuable asset. So you will learn a lot, and you will continue to learn throughout, as I do in my career. And so now I wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what you might learn in this class to hopefully whet your appetite. I, as you know, I'm a wildlife biologist. I specialize in birds, but I do know a fair amount about other wildlife species. And I teach the wildlife ecology class, and I also teach the vertebrate wildlife class. So I talk about all vertebrate wildlife. I talk about mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. Here I'm going to teach you what I teach the class about birds and lizards, because these are the wildlife species that in the summer at least we see most around our houses. These are the most obvious wildlife species. So first I want to talk about lizards, which we see a lot around our homes when we go out hiking, and we have a really wonderful lizard diversity here. So I want to talk about reptiles in general, and this is probably review for many, if not all of you, and then talk about how to identify the common lizard species that we have here in the Santa Fe area in northern New Mexico. So brief overview that's probably not new to everybody, but we'll go over it anyway. Reptiles are ectothermic, so they do not produce their own body heat. Animals that do produce their own body heat, like primates, humans, birds, they're endothermic. As we know, reptiles are covered in dry scales or scutes. There is a difference. Scales are what you find on lizards, for example. They're made from keratin, and they originate from the epidermis, the upper level of your skin. Scutes, such as in turtles, they have bony plates originating from the dermis, so down lower in your skin, and those plates are then covered with a keratin outer layer. So those are scales, and scutes are different things. As far as reptiles, we have two orders of reptiles in northern New Mexico. If you remember back to your high school or college biology classes and taxonomy, you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We're talking about orders here. We have the, turtles in one order, and then lizards and snakes in another order. And I'm going to talk about lizards here, but I talk about all of this in the class. So now we talk a little bit about how to identify some of the many lizards that scurry around our sidewalks and our trails and everywhere we go. The first I want to talk about is the lesser earless lizard. This is a relatively small lizard. And the first thing I want to mention that when you're looking at lizards and wanting to identify them, remember that color in lizards is not a good identification feature. It can really vary depending on where in the state you are and the dominant substrate that these lizards live on. For example, this lesser earless lizard is almost white at White Sands National Park to match the white sands. And here it's dark brown to match our substrates. So don't use color as your primary identifying factor for lizards. The two things that are really obvious for identifying this lizard, and there are other species of earless lizard, but this is the one you're going to find here in northern New Mexico, is they lack external ears. So you can see this is a whiptail photo on the right, and this is the lesser earless lizard on the left. And you can see on the right on this whiptail, hopefully you can see my pointer, that there's a very obvious external ear. And that's lacking on this earless lizard, hence its name. That can be difficult to see, but what is very easy after you've looked at a few to notice is the next identifying factor, in that earless lizards and the lesser earless lizard, they have really small, short heads. They look really tiny compared to the rest of their body. They kind of look pinheaded a little bit. And you can see that by comparing it to the whiptail on the right, which has a much larger elongated head. So that's how to identify a lesser earless lizard. We have two species of spiny lizard in northern New Mexico. First, the plateau fence lizard on the left and the ornate tree lizard on the right. The plateau fence lizard is very common. It's, again, don't use color. It can vary depending on the substrate, and the pattern can vary, but it's never as distinct as the ornate tree lizard. And as you look at lizards too, after a while, you'll say, okay, I know that's a spiny lizard. I know that's a whiptail. Now I just have to figure out which one it is. So spiny lizards are a little bit bigger, and hence their name, they're very spiny looking. So the plateau fence lizard has a much less distinct pattern, and the males have, as you can see, beautiful blue patches on the underside. This can actually be difficult to see unless they're breeding and they're showing off to the ladies. Then they kind of stand there and lift the side of their belly up and show off that blue patch. So if you see that, it's really wonderful to see, but don't depend on seeing that. Just note that it's not nearly as patterned as the ornate tree lizard, which has a very distinctive, beautiful pattern. These are favorites of nearly every human being. I don't know who doesn't love horned lizards, also known as horny toads. You know, they're not toads, of course. That common name came about because of one of their defensive mechanisms. They puff up when they feel threatened, and so they get really fat and they appear to be like a toad. So we actually have two species of horned lizards here in northern New Mexico. And once you learn how to identify them, they're very easy to tell apart. So on the left, we have the greater shorthorn lizard, and then on the right, the round-tailed horned lizard. If you look at where the arrows are pointing on both of them, the greater shorthorn lizard has fringed scales along the side of the body, and the round-tailed horned lizard is lacking those. It's a very distinctive feature. Horned lizards don't run, they tend to freeze instead of running fast, so you should be able to see this feature pretty well when you come across one. The second feature is the shape and pattern of the horns on their head. So the greater shorthorn lizard has many irregularly shaped horns on the back of its head. Compare that to the round-tailed horned lizard, which always has, you can't see the fourth one here, but it always has 4 horns on the back of its head that are the same length and the same size. So using those two identifying factors, you can easily tell apart these two horned lizard species. They can occur in both ponderosa pine and pinyon juniper. I have found personally that I see greater shorthorn lizards more in ponderosa pine, and I see round-tailed horned lizards more in pinyon juniper woodlands, but it can vary. And again, remember, color, don't rely on color. And so horned lizards have a really, really fascinating defense strategy. And so, and the horned lizards that we have in our state, I can't remember which one, but one of them, not both of them, but one of them uses this strategy that I'm going to play a video for you. And it's a very interesting strategy to deter predators.
You're about to witness one of the most bizarre pieces of defensive weaponry ever devised by Mother Nature. Has there ever been a weirder use of an eye socket? Or of blood? This bloody lizard lives near saguaro trees in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. A bird drops saguaro fruit for the harvester ants to munch on. And in turn, the regal horned lizard munches on the ants. The ants make it their business to fight back, looking for a chink in the lizard's body armor. Unfortunately for the ants, the regal horned lizard has a sticky tongue with pretty good aim, and it's immune to ant venom. And its body can actually get all the moisture it needs from the ants, which make up 90% of its diet. Just as the ants are stalked by the lizard is stalked by a coyote, the next link on the food chain. The coyote is fast, deft, and determined. The lizard finally has a reason to deploy its doomsday weapon. That swelling below the lizard's eye isn't a tear duct. It's high-octane coyote repellent, aka blood. Let her rip. Blood pressure builds up to the point where the lizard can actually shoot blood out of its eye with the precision aim of a sharpshooter. And yes, it's nothing more than plain old blood. The coyote wisely retreats to find a less feisty meal. Game, set, match. Victory to the blood-squirting regal horned lizard.
Okay, so that's a very fun defensive tactic that has evolved for horned lizards. And horned lizards, as I mentioned before, when you go out and you see whiptails or some of these fence lizards or spiny lizards, they usually run away really fast. They're very quick lizards, but horned lizards are not. So that facilitated the evolution of alternative defensive strategies. And so that is blood squirting in many of the species and puffing up, like I talked about before, and freezing and blending in very well with their surroundings. When they don't move, they're really hard to see, especially the round-tailed horned lizards that look just like little rocks amongst millions of other rocks at Thornton Ranch, for example. So, they're very interesting creatures. So next I want to talk about our whiptails. We have a lot of whiptail species in northern New Mexico. These are the two larger whiptails. They're large and striking and beautiful. If you see them, you'll notice them right away. They're not quite as common as the whiptails that we'll talk about on the next slide, but they are found throughout this area. You have the Chihuahuan spotted whiptail on the left and the common checkered whiptail on the right. And it's pretty easy to identify these whiptails. All whiptails, hence their name, have very long tails. So you can see that in the photo on the left. And so when you see a lizard with a tail like that, you can automatically say, okay, I know it's a whiptail. Now I just have to figure out what species of whiptail it is. And that's really the best way to start learning to identify things, is to be able to get it down to a group. I know it's a whiptail, I know it's a horned lizard, and then working from there. So you know it's a whiptail because of its extremely long tail, and they're also very fast runners. Then these are the larger whiptails, and the Chihuahuan spotted whiptail has both stripes and spots, as you can see very clearly on it. And the common checkered whiptail, there is well named. It has a checkered pattern throughout its body. Now these are the more difficult whiptails. You've probably, these are the most common lizards you're going to see, especially around our homes. But if you know what to look for, they are easy to differentiate. So I want to talk about what to look for on these species. The three species of smaller whiptails that we have are these three. You have the New Mexico whiptail on the upper left, the plateau striped whiptail on the bottom, and the little striped whiptail on the upper right. So the two factors that you're going to look at to identify these smaller whiptails are what are the shape of the stripes on their back, and do they have blue in their faces? So those are the only two things you have to focus on. So the New Mexico whiptail doesn't have blue in its face, and it has wavy the lines on its back are wavy. Hopefully you can see that in that picture. And it's actually pretty noticeable in the field. You would think it wouldn't be, but it is noticeable. So no blue wavy lines. The plateau striped whiptail has straight lines on its back and no blue in the face. And then as you can see, the little striped whiptail, straight lines, but a lot of blue in its face. So when you actually get down to it, they're pretty easy to tell apart if they sit still long enough for you to actually look at them, which is always an issue. So threats to reptiles, including lizards, unfortunately with all wildlife, they face a lot of threats. Habitat degradation and loss and climate change are almost always the biggest threats for any wildlife taxa or species that you're looking at. Overgrazing is a big one as well, especially for species like lizards that eat a lot of insects. Overgrazing can be very detrimental. And especially for these horned lizards who, as you saw in the video, they eat almost exclusively harvester ants. Harvester ants, as the name implies, harvest seeds from grasses and wildflowers. So overgrazing affects the ants, which then in turn affects the lizards. Release of non-native pets is a threat to reptiles. An example is a lot of people have red-eared slider turtles as pets. They get sick of them and they release them into the rivers of New Mexico. Unfortunately, red-eared sliders are not native here, but we do have our own native slider turtles, and the red-eared sliders compete with our native sliders, and that impacts our native sliders negatively. Collection for pet trade is a big one for reptiles, especially for horned lizards. Horned lizards are cute and they're easy to catch. But one thing that's very beneficial about the Master Naturalist program and people learning about this stuff is that they can then impart that knowledge on other people. And so one important thing to impart on other people is that when you take a horned lizard out of the wild and you try to keep it in your house, they're almost impossible to keep alive. They eat a lot of ants and they need to be alive. And that is almost impossible to provide for them in captivity. So collecting them and trying to keep them as a pet, however well-intentioned, will likely end up in their demise. So that's an important thing to remember. You know, and I know, unfortunately, I did not have this privilege because horned lizards had already declined by the time I got to the point. Well, I didn't grow up with horned lizards in Vermont, but when I came here, they had declined so much that they weren't around a whole lot. But I've heard a lot of stories of people when they were children having horned lizards for a short while in their house, or watching them, playing with them. They're a really treasured species for people. And a lot of people ask, where have all the horny toads gone? And unfortunately, all the horned lizard species are declining and of concern. And then of course, persecution, especially when it comes to snakes. Many people have an innate fear of snakes and therefore kill all snakes, regardless of whether they are venomous or not. And rattlesnake roundups are particularly disturbing, where they round up a lot of snakes and kill them. So these are some of the threats to these reptiles. But again, you can help. It's sad to see these threats, but you learn about them and then you can help with mitigating some of these threats. For example, I told you one of our volunteers is working on surveying for horned lizards and their prey, harvester ants, at the Thornton Ranch open space, so that when we do put trails in, we can make sure that we're avoiding any particularly important areas for horned lizards. So you learn about these threats and it's sad, but you also get to help try to mitigate these threats, which is very rewarding. So now I'm also going to talk about birds. This is my area of expertise and birds are very near and dear to my heart. This will be a little different because there's so many bird species in northern New Mexico. New Mexico is actually the 4th most diverse state in the country, preceded only by California, Arizona, and I always forget the last one. I think it's Florida. But we are the 4th most diverse state for birds in the country. So I don't go into bird identification in my presentation, but we have bird identification field trips and other opportunities. So a little overview of birds. Again, this is probably review for everybody, but we'll go ahead and cover it just in case. Birds are endothermic, of course. They produce their own body heat. We all know birds have feathers. They're a unique modification of the outer skin. And this is the one feature that identifies birds and nothing else. There's no comparable structure in any other vertebrate. Birds, of course, have bills or beaks, however you want to describe them. This is unique, but it's not distinct just for birds. For example, a mammal, the duck-billed platypus, has a beak-like structure. So feathers are the identifying factor for birds. Now, this is why I don't go over specific bird identification. If you remember, for reptiles, we have 2 orders of reptiles in New Mexico. We have 17 orders of birds in New Mexico. So that's a lot. They're much more numerous and diverse. It's a very diverse order of vertebrates. Class of vertebrates. The order Passeriformes, these are the perching birds, that constitutes the largest portion of birds in New Mexico and the world. This includes, some of the birds that are included in this order include flycatchers, vireos, ravens, crows, jays, and so on. It's a very large order that constitutes the majority of the bird diversity in the world. And it's a wonderful order of birds in the class Aves. Birds are also really fascinating. You know, we all hear bird song, and some of us, like myself, I have to know how to identify birds by sound only for my work when I go out and do bird surveys. But birds have the greatest sound producing capabilities of all vertebrates, especially the songbirds. So I want to play here. We've all listened to birds, but when you really stop and listen to it closely, it's amazing how complex their songs are. So here I want to play a video of a yellow warbler singing, and just have us just really focus in on the beauty of that song and the complexity of that song. This is also a species that occurs here in high numbers in northern New Mexico. You'll find them in riparian areas, which are the forests along rivers and creeks. And you may not always see them, but they're a beautiful bright yellow bird. The males then also have red stripes on their chest during the breeding season, and they have a beautiful song. So let me go ahead and play that for you all. And then we can all dream about this happening in a few months. I'm dreaming about bird song coming back. I personally can listen to warblers sing all day long. They're some of my favorite birds, but very beautiful, complex sound producing capabilities in birds. Birds also, you know, flying takes a lot of energy, and they have very high body temperatures to then fuel their very powerful wing muscles. And they're very, as we all know, very well adapted to flight. They have really strong but lightweight skeletons. Many of the bones in their skeletons are fused to allow them to still be lightweight but strong. On their rib cages, they have bones that actually, you know, your ribs come down, and then they have bones that go horizontal to connect the rib cage and make it stronger. They also have an enlarged and keeled sternum that helps to anchor those large breast muscles. So they're very, very well adapted to flight. It wants to play another video for us. Oops. Here, birds also have amazing hearing capabilities. Their hearing range encompasses infrasounds, so sounds below what we can hear. They also can have much better color vision than us. Their color vision reaches into the near ultraviolet range of the spectrum. Birds also have a really large, birds have very large, well-developed brains. So similar to primates, including humans, They have functional lateralization of their brains, so your left and right brain, with the left hemispheric dominance, or the left brain, being associated with learning and innovation, like humans. Corvids rather, from the family Corvidae, the bird family Corvidae, are amongst the smartest of birds and vertebrates in general. This includes crows, ravens, and jays, different species of jays. And so I have another fun video for us to see just how intelligent corvids are. This is about crows and how they can learn and innovate. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
Crows have become highly skilled at making a living in these new urban environments. In this Japanese city, they have devised a way of eating a food that normally they can't manage. Dropping a nut from a great height onto a hard road does sometimes crack it, but some nuts are particularly tough. So the crows have devised a better way. Drop it among the traffic. The problem now is collecting the bits without getting run over. So some birds have refined their technique. They station themselves beside pedestrian crossings. Wait for the lights to stop the traffic. Then collect your cracked nut in safety.
So I love that video. I never get sick of watching it. So there's a book that I recommend folks read if you're interested more in raven in particular intelligence, but corvid and intelligence. It's called The Mind of the Raven, and it's by Bernd Heinrich. He was a professor of mine at the University of Vermont. It's a really amazing book on raven intelligence. And with that book and this movie, you'll never look at ravens the same again. And I recently learned that many Native American tribes, so in our European Western culture, we don't tend to associate ravens and crows with good things, right? They're associated with death or just bad things. But owls, for example, are associated with wisdom. But I recently learned, and when I learned this, I thought they really knew their birds and had seen how smart ravens and crows are. In many Native American cultures, I learned that the owl is a symbol of death and the raven is a symbol of wisdom. So they obviously had noticed how smart these birds are. So hopefully when you look at the next raven you see, you appreciate them a lot more. They're really amazing birds. So now I want to talk a little bit about a few birds of conservation concern here in northern New Mexico. You know, we're probably all very familiar with some species of conservation concern. For example, the spotted owl. There's been a lot of newspaper articles, etc., about this bird species plight. But there are other species that most people are not nearly as familiar with, that are doing just as poorly or worse than the spotted owl. So I want to talk a little bit about a few of those so that you're aware of them and their importance. So the first is the pinyon jay. Hopefully everyone here has seen pinyon jays. We do have other jay species that sometimes people confuse them with. We do have the Woodhouse's scrub jay, which has a lot of different colors on it. It has black and more white, and tend to be by themselves or just with one other jay. Pinyon jays tend to be in big flocks. They're very noisy. They're all blue without black or white, and they have very long bills. So just be sure when you're looking at jays to not confuse Woodhouse's scrub jays with pinyon jays. And sorry, in retrospect, I should have included a photo here of the Woodhouse's scrub jay. So pinyon jays, as I mentioned earlier, are one of the fastest declining bird species we have in the country and the world. Their population has declined by about 85% since the 1960s, and the remaining much smaller population is expected to be cut in half again by only 2035. So the situation is very dire for these birds that are just wonderful birds, but that are also extremely important for the persistence of our pinions, in particular in our pinyon juniper woodlands. So I guess I should also back up for a minute and say that of all the bird species in northern New Mexico, there are only a few, or in all of New Mexico rather, there are only a few that are on the IUCN Red List. So that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They have a red list of species most in danger of extinction throughout the world. And the pinyon jay is on this list. It's listed at the same level as the Indian one-horned rhino and the African lion. So those are two, large, charismatic megafauna species that probably you'd be hard pressed to find a human that doesn't recognize that those are in danger. But just keep in mind that the pinyon jay is at the same level and in the same danger as those more well-known species. And so pinyon jays are extremely important for the persistence of our pinions and our pinyon juniper woodlands. Many pine species have lightweight seeds with wings on them, so they can be dispersed by air, through the air, by wind. But if you've ever eaten a pinyon nut or collected a pinyon nut, you know that that's not the case for pinyon pines. Pinyon pine seeds or nuts are very large, very heavy, and they do not have wings. So they can only be distributed by animals. Their primary distributors are a couple of species of corvid. So pinyon jays being the main one, also Clark's nutcrackers, and small mammals like mice. But the primary way they disperse these seeds over long distances is through pinyon jays. Pinyon jays, so when pinyon pines produce their seeds or their nuts in fall, you'll see pinyon jay flocks flying all over the place. They're covering thousands of acres. They're collecting as many pinyon nuts as they can, thousands upon thousands, and they're storing them to eat throughout the year because pinyon trees typically produce their nuts only in fall. This is primarily all pinyon jays eat, are pinyon nuts. So they need to store them so they can eat them throughout the year. So they store them in the ground. And they are because they're corvids, they're very, very smart, and they have a wonderful spatial memory, and they can usually find all of these thousands of seeds without the aid of a GPS unit, but they inevitably forget where they put some, and then they've essentially planted a pinyon pine. So the pinyon jay and the pinyon pine are in a very, very close mutualistic relationship. It's also interesting too, pinyon jays are very, very social, as you can gather from being in flocks. They do everything together, and when they mate, they're in monogamous pairs for life. They've even done sometimes I don't understand why some research is done, but they've done research where they tried to separate the pairs and see if they would cheat, and they didn't. They've also done research that shows that pinyon jays, they make sure their partner knows where their seeds are stashed. So, sort of an insurance policy that, honey, if I die, here's where my pinyon nuts are. So they're extremely fascinating birds that we have a lot in common with. They're very important ecologically, and they're doing very poorly. So there's been a growing amount of work being done for this bird species, and for good reason. Threats to pinyon jays include climate change effects on pinyon pines. So we are all familiar with climate change effects in causing pinyon pines to die in large numbers. We all have seen or lived through, the most recent pinyon pine mass mortality event here in northern New Mexico. But what a lot of people don't realize is that if the pinions don't die and they're still alive, they're still actually being negatively affected. They actually produce far fewer seeds with higher temperatures and lower precipitation. So they're not producing as much food, even if they're still alive. Other threats include woodland thinning for a variety of reasons and overgrazing. Now, when you're identifying birds, it's very, very important if you're wanting to do a very thorough job. So for example, for me, when I'm doing bird surveys, that bird calls and songs. And this is a skill that takes a long time to develop, can be very frustrating. And you'll never know it all, because every bird species has numerous calls, numerous song variations. There's different dialects of bird songs depending on where they live, like humans. So it can be difficult, but it's also very rewarding. And my colleagues joke that, when I'm outside, I'm half listening to them and half noting all the birds that are singing around us. And it is true. I am doing both of those things. But I wanted to play for you the Pinyon Jay call. If you haven't heard this before, it's a wonderful call, and you should hear it as Pinyon Jay's flocks fly over your neighborhood. If you hear this song, look up, because a Pinyon Jay flock is probably flying by. So let me go ahead and play it if you haven't heard it already. And if you have heard it, it'll just be a wonderful reminder. Oops, sorry. Oops. So they're just wonderful, social, noisy birds. So you'll always hear them. Another species that is a beautiful species that is much harder to see is the Grace's warbler, this beautiful little warbler right here. This species is found, they're a ponderosa pine forest specialist, and typically they migrate here in the summer to breed, and they're typically found foraging and nesting in the very tippy tops of ponderosa pine. So they're really hard to actually see, but they're very vocal. And as you're hiking through ponderosa pine forest, you'll hear their very distinctive, beautiful song. I'll play that for you now. Note that the notes go up in tempo, which is unique amongst warbler songs, and there are very few other bird species that do it. So if you hear this in ponderosa pine forest, you're probably hearing a Grace's warbler. Let me go ahead and play that. So that is one of my favorite bird songs of all time. It's actually the ringtone for my phone. So I confuse people sometimes when a bird starts singing in the house. But Grace's warblers are unfortunately not doing well either. Their population has declined by about half since the 1960s. Similar threats to pinyon jay, climate change, overgrazing, and heavy forest thinning in ponderosa pine forests. Light thinning of ponderosa pine forest can benefit this bird, but it's complicated, and I have written a paper on this, and I'm happy to share it with anyone, but there becomes a point where it is detrimental, where it goes from beneficial to detrimental. And we're actually currently conducting research on a county open space to try to determine where that point is, and make sure we have a property where we have a lot of Grace's warblers, and we want to make sure that we're properly managing their habitat and making sure that we, at the very least, maintain their population or increase it. And I will also mention too, if you look at the range map on the right, this is a bird species that has a very limited range, especially in the United States. It's really only found in any good numbers in New Mexico and Arizona. So New Mexico is very important for this bird species. We're also very important for pinion jays. We have about 1/3 of the global population of pinion jays in New Mexico. And this bird species is special. We have a lot of special bird species in New Mexico. This is a bird species that birders like to call a southwestern specialty. Birders come from the East Coast and all over the United States to see this bird and other species that only occur usually in Arizona and New Mexico and Mexico and Central America. But if they want to see it in the United States without taking an international trip, they come here or to Arizona. And the last bird I want to talk about is another warbler. This one's also very hard to see, but it's the Virginia's warbler, and its population has declined by about 40% since the 1960s. Very similar threats, but this one, oak removal is also a very large threat. In ponderosa pine forests, you'll notice a lot of gamble oak. It's very important for wildlife and very important for this bird species in particular. You usually won't find it in areas without oak. So if you're in a ponderosa pine forest with a lot of shrubby oak in the understory, you're in Virginia's warbler habitat. So this is my final slide. And so I think one of the things that I love about my career and about nature, and I've loved nature from, the very moment I could look at spiders walking around my yard or catch frogs in our neighborhood pond in Vermont. The thing I love most is that until the day I die, I will be learning something new about nature, about the environment, and about all of the species that we share this wonderful planet with. And so that is also, I hope, one of the best benefits of becoming a master naturalist is learning more about all of this. And every time you step outside, it's that much more enjoyable, because now you're noticing the bird songs you've learned, you're noticing the plants you've learned, you're noticing the lizards and the butterflies and ants that you've learned. And it just makes everything more beautiful, in my opinion. Not to be sappy, but this video is a video about a mouse species that we have here, right here in Santa Fe. I've heard them actually calling in my neighborhood at night. And it's a species that has it's a very interesting species. And I hope that this is new information for most, if not all of you. So let's go ahead and play this, and we'll end with this wonderful video.
In the middle of the Sonoran Desert, this mother grasshopper mouse tends to her pups. While tiny and adorable, don't be mistaken, this is not your common house mouse. From the day they are born, these mice are natural killers. Insects, lizards, scorpions, and even other mice are all on the menu. This mouse is distinguished from most other rodents in its reliance on a meat-based diet. It regularly takes on prey as large or larger than itself. Making the grasshopper mouse even more of a standout is its immunity to scorpion venom. Not only can it withstand the typically deadly stings, its body has adapted to convert the toxins into a painkiller. After a scorpion, a giant centipede might seem easy. However, these centipedes are venomous. A pocket mouse has already fallen victim to its toxins. Grasshopper mouse isn't intimidated. This time, the trick up its sleeve isn't immunity, but agility. It uses its quick reflexes to avoid the venom from the centipede's fangs. Before it enjoys another fresh kill, the mouse proclaims its territory by howling. The mouse throws its head back and lets out a high-pitched cry into the night sky, giving it the nickname of werewolf mouse.
All right, that little guy lives in our backyard, so a little wolf mouse. But yeah, with that, I hope that you're hopefully interested in learning more and helping and becoming a master naturalist. And if nothing else, hopefully you learned something tonight and can pass on what you learned tonight, because teaching people about the plight of some of these wildlife species and just fun facts about wildlife is very important. And so I guess with that, I will go ahead and take any questions and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Peggy, I don't know if you saw on the chat function, but Bruce had a question about when is breeding season for those migrators? And if Bruce, if you want to elaborate on that, you can unmute yourself.
So the breeding season for migrants here is usually, it depends on the species, of course, but usually migrants will begin breeding in April and May and be done by July, middle of July usually. The Grace's warbler, it starts, that's pretty consistent with the Grace's warbler breeding season. So when I do bird surveys for, and I want to catch both our resident birds like pinion jays and also our migrant birds, I typically do them in late May. So I do surveys for Grace's warbler on one of our properties in late May. And that is a potential future master naturalist project is helping me with those. And it's in the Ortiz Mountains, people that go out and help me with it can camp out there with me, which is an opportunity people don't get because it's a property that we're only allowed to take people out to on guided hikes, and camping is only allowed for research purposes. So that's another example of a project is helping me conduct those surveys. I conduct the bird surveys and then associated plant surveys where we measure things like canopy cover, etc. So, but yeah, those are the dates for breeding birds that arrive here. Oh, Karen, I think you're muted. I don't know if you're trying to talk.
I wasn't trying to talk. I was laughing at Bruce's message. Can everybody see the chat function? Because there's some stuff coming in on that. Any other questions can come in on the chat function, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask if you can.
Hopefully, as soon as it gets warm, you'll all run out there and start identifying birds and lizards.
Peggy, maybe you can mention how they get in touch or how the people could sign up for the Master Naturalist program.
Sure. So did you send out the Master Naturalist website in your email blast by chance?
I don't know.
Sounds like no. Let me quickly look up the website and put it in the chat. I'll also put my email address in the chat. And if you're interested in being notified when the next class starts, just send me an email, or you can check the website. We'll post it on there. Again, the next class will start in late August. But let me go ahead and pull up the Master Naturalist website and I can put that. Sorry, it might take me just a moment.
Peggy, this is Peggy. While you're doing that, I know you told us that we may need to not work on Thornton Ranch starting in March because that's the breeding times for the pinyon jay? So do they start a little sooner than most?
That's a really good question. Yes, they do. So pinyon jays are resident, and in general, resident birds tend to breed earlier. But pinyon jays are very early breeders, and in fact, they can breed at any time of the year if the pinyon nut crop was good. But typically, they'll start nesting in March and be done by May. And they nest because they do everything in a group. They actually nest together as a group in the same general location year after year. So identifying and protecting their nesting sites is very important. And the county has done numerous years of pinyon jay surveys, and we've identified 2 to 3, one that's not being used anymore, but 2 active nesting colony traditional sites. And so one is at Thornton Ranch, and we're working to protect that colony nesting site through a variety of ways. But one thing we try to do is limit disturbance when they're nesting. And so we'll try to have volunteers stay away to give them some peace and quiet. Also, when the property opens to the public, the trails don't go very close to the nesting colony, and any trails that are closest to it will be closed during the breeding season when the property opens. So we're trying our very best and the pinyon seed planting effort is, of course, one of the major reasons is to help that pinyon jay nesting flock. And I do see that we can't do anything until August. Not necessarily. It depends on the project you choose. Oh, you mean if you want to become a master naturalist? Yes, you won't be able to do anything until August. But if you become a master naturalist and you're volunteering, the projects really vary. A lot of the projects are done in the summer because that's when a lot of wildlife are active and breeding and they're easy to survey. But we do have some volunteers that become property stewards for us. We have a lot of properties spread out throughout the county. There's only 2 of us in the open space program. And so we can't get out and monitor them as much as we need to make sure that everything is good and there's nothing we need to address. So master naturalists sign up to steward 1 or more properties and then go out whenever they can. We hope for once a month, but whenever they can and have the time, and just check on things for us. So that can happen at any time of the year. And there are many other projects that can happen at any time of the year. But yeah, the class won't be starting until August. Perhaps we should have this presentation closer to the to the start time, but then you can just be looking forward to it for many months. And let me type my email in the chat box and just email me and I will put you on a list and we'll notify you. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that there. So you can email me and I'll keep your name and I'll notify you when we start advertising the course and when you can start signing up for the course.
Okay, well, Peggy, I'd like to, on behalf of the Tano Road Association, I'd like to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Absolutely.
Any other, yes. Silent clapping, virtual clapping.
Virtual clapping, yes.
Oh.
That's the real virtual clapping.
Excellent. Any last minute thoughts from anybody? Questions, Peggy, Helen, other Peggy?
Well, I just want to,
Yes.
oh, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question about the birds in Tano Road area. My wife and I were hoping to learn about the birds here and to see pictures of them. How hard would it be to get a presentation from Peggy on the birds in our area?
So there's actually a wonderful, so what we gave to our master naturalists this year. So typically in the past, I would have a host a field trip and we'd go out and learn to identify birds in the field. Of course, that didn't happen this past year. But what we did do is for the field trip, our volunteers had the option of watching, for the identification portion, had an option of watching a previously recorded webinar put out by Audubon Southwest, previously Audubon New Mexico. And so I can, let's see, can I email that to Peggy and Karen? Can I email you a link to that video and then you can share it with everyone? It's a wonderful introductory webinar on identifying bird species in our area. And so because that video existed and because we were having volunteers look at it anyway, my presentation, I switched it to focusing on other things besides identification. But that video is available and is really great. And so I will send that out to Peggy and Karen, and then they can see.
Can we identify the Tano Road area birds in that? Video?
Yeah, so almost every bird.
That's what we're interested in.
Yeah, almost every bird in that presentation, if not every bird, are the birds on Tano Road. They're birds that they identify the most common birds, and those are going to be the most common birds in your area as well.
Anything else?
Well, and I just want to say too that the other Peggy, your Peggy, has been out there almost every week planting pinyon seeds with a fellow volunteer, and is a wonderful, wonderful volunteer. So you need to give her a round of applause as well.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, for coming and sharing your story with us tonight. For those who are still with us, if you've liked the presentation, enjoyed it, let us know if there's something else that you'd like to talk about or hear about. Let us know. We'd like your feedback. We're also thinking about doing a happy hour in the upcoming months. So if that would be something of interest, just send us your ideas. Maybe you know someone that has a specialty that would like to share with our group. Let us know. So your feedback is really important. So that's all I have. Thank you for attending. Be safe, be well, and thanks again.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Peggy. That was really good. Then Karen and everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful.